Hello world and true believers. This is Brenda, Lost Aspie Girl, and I wanted to make today's video about females on the spectrum and sense of self, because I've been reading a lot lately about females on the spectrum. A lot of females on the spectrum. This seems to happen to females more than males, not having a very strong sense of self, and I've been thinking about that. I'm wondering why that is the case, because I actually have a very strong sense of self. And the more I thought about it, the more it began to make sense to me. Because if you're mind blind the way we are, then you're not going to the social world around you is not going to have as much of an impact or an influence on you the way it is to the rest of the world. So if you're out there and, like, I think for me, part of the reason I have such a strong sense of self is first, like, when I was growing up, I was very much a tomboy, and my mom wanted me to be more feminine when I was younger, and my father secretly encouraged my weirdness and my desire to own swords and be a warrior princess, or princess warrior as I used to call it when I was little. Actually even developed my own princess warrior code when I was 12. And although I'm not saying that my dad did everything right, trust me, he did not. But in this regard, he actually encouraged me to be my own self. You know, he one of the things he used to always tell me all the time is like, he would laugh at his own jokes even if they weren't funny. And he would always be like, he'd nudge me and be like, remember, it's always about your own entertainment. If no one else is laughing, it doesn't matter. And these were like little seeds that stuck in my head, like, you know, because probably when I was about 8 years old is when I started having difficulties making friends, and my sister was only a year younger than me, and she made friends very easily. It was also around this time when I started writing my dad letters when I would get in trouble. I was a voracious reader at this point in my life, because the outside world didn't always make sense to me. People didn't make sense to me, but comic books and sci-fi and fantasy did, and they a lot of times had social commentary, and it helped me to kind of understand the world in a way I wasn't able to understand it through people. And my dad secretly encouraged this also. He would take me to the bookstores and he bought me lots of books, and he read these types of books too. And he was this big burly guy, someone who you would never think read sci-fi and fantasy. But as we've discussed in other videos, looks can be quite deceiving. So he encourages, even though my mom did not encourage it at all. Like, I would be like, Mom, I want to buy a sword. And she'd be like, girls don't own swords. Or she would even say things, I used to get frustrated. She would be like, my sister and I had to do chores and my brother didn't. And I'm like, why do we have to do chores and my younger brother doesn't? She's like, because boys don't know how to do chores. I'm like, well, according to what you're saying, right? I'm like, do I do good with the chores? She's like, no, not at all. I'm like, so, but Danielle does good with, my sister does well with chores. I probably shouldn't say her name. I'm like, so she can learn, if she can learn it, and Joe does better when he does do chores than me, so that by that theory, like, he can learn to do chores, and I'm not doing a good job doing chores. So if I am not doing well at chores, then why do I have to do chores? She's like, because boys aren't the ones that do chores. I'm like, you're just saying that because that's what you were taught, but reality is going against what you're saying, because I'm the one who has difficulty performing my chores, so let's try to look at this realistically. But she just didn't want to hear any of that, and because I was just trying to get out of doing my chores. But so, like, that's how I was as a little girl. Also, I would get in trouble with my father, and that's, like I said, I started writing letters to him around when I was 8 years old, and he actually liked that I wrote these letters, partly because, like, my sister was very manipulative. But what I did, like, I was very direct, but in the way I would do it was, like, I realized sometimes I had to placate him. So I would write him a letter, basically because I wanted to tell him I thought he was wrong. But I realized that I couldn't just go about it that way. So I would first say, I understand that you punished me because you thought this, and I learned this from this. I understand this. But, this is why I disagree with you. And, I might be a kid and I might not have as much experience as you, but I have different experiences as you, even from this age, and I can see things from a different perspective, because I was a strange little child. So, like, and obviously, you can tell from that I had no friends at all. And that used to frustrate me. And I remember my dad sitting me down around this time, and he's like, your sister is very book smart. I mean, your sister is very people smart. You're very book smart. Your sister's very, very people smart. But these are inherent skills. These are the things that you kind of were born with. But your sister, if she wants to, and he's like, I don't think she ever will, can learn to be book smart if she wants to eventually. He's like, you can learn to be people smart if you want. You just have to learn to read people the way you learn to read books, which I couldn't seem to do. But what I realized I could do at a young age is I could read my sister, and I could mimic her, and that helped me, helped facilitate much of my childhood into teenage years. And because I realized at a very young age, if I could act the way I was supposed to act, and I couldn't figure out how I was supposed to act the way other people did. What I found out is if I watched my sister in certain situations and I acted the way my sister acted, then I could do it. But it wasn't who I really was, and it felt like I was clothing that I wore. Like when I went to school, as a role that I played. Like I put on these clothing that were my sister and acted the way I thought she would act. But when I got home, I took it off. So that wasn't who I was. I just did it because it was what was expected of me, and people didn't treat me as poorly when I did that. And I started to make friends, and around 14, I developed, and my high school career probably could have been much worse if I wasn't a better study of my sister. but it wasn't who I was. And so the sense of self that I had back then, even though I learned to act in a way, but see, a lot of people I know that probably neurosocials are watching this and like, if you can act that way, then why don't you just do that all the time? But think about it, it's a delay. I'm not acting the way, I'm not reading other people and learning from that. I'm watching my sister, and in situations where I've seen her act a certain way, I'm acting that way. So there's a delay. It's like a computer processing. It's like I'm not going to a situation and then reading the situation and then acting that way. I'm just acting the way I think my sister would act. That doesn't mean I've actually read somebody properly or I'm responding and I even understand what just happened. I'm just acting in a way that I saw someone else act because I know it will keep me out of trouble. It's a completely different thing, and I think it's very difficult for someone who isn't on the spectrum to understand what I'm saying right now. So, because like I said, I mentioned this in a previous video. It's like imagine if you're colorblind and because there really is a spectrum of social colors that the social brain can see. And the way I've said this before, and I've mentioned this, it's kind of like, how when you look up in the sky and you see a flock of birds flying, and they all fly together, and they all know when to turn, and they all turn together? You guys are just like that. And the only reason you don't notice that, and you think it's amazing how you see the birds do it, is because when you're doing it, you're together. Like, the birds don't think they're amazing that they're flying together. But if you think about the times that you've walked with a bunch of people. When you walk, you guys all turn together. You're all talking. You're not even paying attention. And one person will know where they're going, and all of a sudden you don't even know. You don't even know that you've decided that person's a leader of your group, and then you're going to follow that person. When I'm with you guys, I don't understand. Like, I'm like, why are we following that person? Where are we going? Like, I'll be walking, and all of a sudden I'll just be walking my way, and everybody will turn. They're like, where are you going? But I'm like, I don't know. How do you guys all know when to go and who to follow? And I don't understand. I also think that's why we confuse people, because sometimes we act in what seems like a dominant manner, and sometimes a submissive manner. It's not because we're posturing or whatever. It's not because of that. It's because some people are like, and this is another thing that I think is interesting, because I think the social brain thinks of people as either being leaders or followers. There's no real in between. And even when I was a little kid, that's something else my mom used to say to me all the time. She'd always say, there are leaders and there are followers. I'm so glad my kids aren't leaders. And I would get very frustrated, because in my head I would be like, maybe there's another thing. Maybe there's people that just dance to the beat of their own drum, and they don't want to lead anybody or follow anybody, and they just want to do their own thing, and I don't understand why that's not okay. My mom says no such thing as that. But that's been like a trend all my life, where like I would meet somebody and they would say, like, there's either path A or there's path B, and and I would want to pick C, and they would be like, there's no C, and I'd be like, so in my mind, I think, like a lot of times people that are on the spectrum, it's like we want to forge our own path. I heard a noise. I got a little freaked out. I'm in my apartment alone, and the lights actually went out the other night. Sorry. So we want to forge our own path. But if I think that also has to do with sense of will, like a strength of will and in character, and like the sense of self, and that develops like early on or during those formative years. And I think like the type of family that you come from, how supportive they are, and things of that nature, they're going to affect all those things, because maybe we're not necessarily influenced socially, but we are going to be influenced by our familial surroundings and by the people that are closest to us. Because even though we might not have the same type of relationship with other people that most people do, we still care about the people we care about. We're just different. This is actually an interesting story, I think, that goes along with that. I'm very close to my niece Mia. There's actually a video I put up of her where she calls me a child, because she doesn't think I'm a real adult. She really doesn't believe I'm an adult. She'll say that all the time. We get into arguments. I'll actually tell you 2 stories. One story was once I was over my sister's house, and I brought food into the living room, and my niece is like, "Mommy, why does Brenda get to bring," because yeah, she calls me Brenda, she doesn't call me auntie. "Why does Brenda get to bring food into the living room and eat in the living room and I don't?" And she goes, "'Cause she doesn't make a mess." And I got upset, and I was like, or maybe it's because I'm an adult and I can do whatever I want. And she's like, "You're not an adult, you're a child." I'm like, "I'm an adult." And she's like, "You're a child." And my sister's like, "Brenda, you're arguing." And she was like 6 at the time. She's like, "You're arguing with a 6-year-old. I think that shows that you're a child." And then the next story is, this is a little less than a year ago. I'm babysitting her, and she kept wanting to call her mom and dad, and she kept calling them, and then all of a sudden she wanted to go home, and I got a little upset, and I was like, "Why do you keep on calling? Like, I thought we were having fun. What happened?" She goes, "When you were a little girl, didn't you ever miss your mommy and daddy? When you like you would go to someone's house and they were babysitting you, didn't you ever miss your mommy and daddy?" And I was like, and I thought about it, and I was like, no, and that never happened. And because whenever I would go anywhere, I didn't, as soon as my parents were gone, it was like, it was out of sight, out of mind. I didn't think about them at all. It wasn't that I didn't care about them. I figured they were going to do their own thing. It just never occurred to me to even think about them. But then I remember how my sister was, and she was just like my niece. And when my parents would drop her off, she would freak out, and she'd want to go home, and have to call them and check on them. She would have, I don't even know what would go on, and I was like, "What the hell is wrong with you?" I don't really understand that. She was also the same with me. I used to sometimes want to be alone, and I would climb trees with a backpack full of books, and she would have to follow me, and I would find creative ways of getting away from her. I should actually make some videos about that, because the adventures with my sister when we were young were pretty interesting. Cause she's only a year apart. She's a year and 1 month younger than me, so almost like Irish twins. And so I'm saying this to my niece. She's like, "Don't you have any feelings?" And I was like, "Yes, and you're hurting them right now by wanting to leave. I thought we were having fun." And she couldn't understand why I was upset, because in her mind, I'm an adult, I shouldn't care. And in my mind, I'm like, "I thought we were having fun. You don't want to hang out with me anymore." And again, like that. I think that has, and maybe it's just me, but I think it has a lot to do with being on the spectrum and how, like, we care about the people we're with, but I think that our connection to them is different. And so again, like, and I think once again that relates also back to sense of self, because of the way we connect to people, the fact that we're not influenced by society and our social surroundings the way everybody else is. We don't define ourselves in the same way, and if we don't, like, if we don't learn to define ourselves through our own authentic self at a young age, then I think that we girls on the spectrum usually, and I think it happens to guys too, but from all the statistics and everything that I've read, it happens to females more often than it happens to males. And I've discussed a few times in a few other videos, I don't necessarily think that's because our neurology is different. I just think it's the way society is set up, and that girls have to learn to socialize at a younger age. It's much more difficult for us to survive if we don't. And but also, I also think the interesting thing, if you think about it, throughout history, what have some of the greatest thinkers done to find out who they are, or to come up with some of the greatest epiphanies and discoveries of time? They've gone off into the mountains, they've meditated, they've disconnected from the world. And guess what, people? Especially you neurosocials out there, our brains, the Asperger, Aspie, autistic brain is wired to disconnect, to develop in a bubble, to to be able to walk that inner maze and find true consciousness, not through groupthink and not through the herd mentality. And I'm not saying that that's bad. It has its own wonderful things going on with it, but I'm just saying that that's why we're not defective. I mean, people go out of their way to disconnect, and we do that naturally. Our brains are wired to be like that. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It can actually be quite advantageous if it's utilized properly. If and I think that's why. So this message to all you girls out there, or even guys on the spectrum that don't have a sense of self, you can find it. It's inside yourself. You don't need to look outside you to define yourself. Look in. That's where it is. There's nothing outside yourself that is important. Look inside yourself and you will find out who you are. Hold on to that authentic self. That is what's most important. Not like what they say in, like, be true to yourself. No, it's because, the way the social brain works sometimes frustrates me, because they'll say things, be true to yourself, all this stuff. And then when you're treated like, you can't act that way, that's not appropriate. It's like, what do you want? Which one? It's like people are paradoxical, but they tell themselves a story all the time, and then once they tell themselves a story, they have to stay in with that story. People are contradictory by nature. Own it. But, and I think that we are set up to be that way. We're okay with the contradictions that are human nature. And I think that when you realize that, and you realize that the dialectic is not a bad thing. Two opposing concepts, two seemingly contradictory concept can exist almost harmoniously. That's what a dialectic is. That's what dialectical behavior therapy is about. It's about holding two seemingly opposing thoughts in your head and seeing that they can exist together. I mean, I think it causes a lot of people cognitive dissonance. I think it's less likely to do that with us. So if you find you're a paradox, that's okay. You're human. Everybody is. And one more thing before I go, I was thinking more about the literal brain today, and how sometimes I'm literal. And I was thinking about something that happened to me back when I was like 21. So remember, I'm 42. So this was like 21 years ago. And I was dating this guy. And I think this is a good idea, like good example of the literal brain. And he had some money and everything like that. Like he's wealthy. And he said, I want you to go buy some stuff. He's like, here's some money. I'm like, what do you want me to get? He's like, something really nice. He's like, whatever you want. And I was like, okay. And I went out and I bought a bunch of books. And I came back and he's like, what the fuck is this? And I said, you told me to buy some stuff to get whatever I want. And he's like, yeah, I meant clothes. And I was like, you didn't say that. You said, get whatever the fuck I want. And I'm like, why did you gave me the money and I should be able to pick? You didn't give me, if there are stipulations, they should be said. He's like, it was implied. I'm like, where was the implication? I didn't see that. If you want me to do something, just tell me. And he's like, you're just trying to aggravate me. And he really thought that. And I realized like how many times in my life that's happened where someone hasn't been direct with me, and then I did what I thought that they meant, because I took it what they said literally, and then they thought that I was just being annoying. And this is what I meant about females being held to a higher standard. We look a certain, especially if we look quote unquote normal. So, like, we can get a lot of things right. But then all of a sudden a situation like this will come up, and then people will be like, oh, you're just trying to aggravate me, or you're just trying to be annoying, or another thing will happen a lot of times is someone will say something, and I'll correct them. I won't feel like I'm correcting them. Like, oh, is this what you meant? Because it's not because I'm trying to correct them. It's because I want to make sure that I got the right interpretation of what they're saying. Because, well, I don't think a lot of people with the social brain understand your neurosocials, is that the English language is very complicated. And even within one word, depending on the context, can completely change its meaning. Take the word truth. I feel like this word is a perfect example. One end of the spectrum of the word truth, it means belief. On the other end, it means facts. Something can be factual and someone will not believe it all. It doesn't matter how much evidence you give them. If they don't believe it's true, they don't believe it's true. Someone can believe something is true no matter how much facts you give them. They to contradict with their belief, they will still, they'll still believe whatever it is they believe. Belief can also be just about being honest. It can be someone's personal philosophy. Truth can be a multitude of things, and depending on the context it's used, will change its meaning. Now, that depends on 70% of communication is nonverbal. We on the spectrum depend on the verbal quite significantly. And if the correct word isn't used in the correct way, we get confused. So a lot of times you think that we're correcting you. He's like, oh, did you mean this? And people will get upset. No, we're not correcting you. We're just trying to clarify because we don't want to be confused. And then people will say things like, you're overthinking things. Well, how am I overthinking it if I didn't know which one you meant? If in my mind, when you said something, 5 different possibilities popped up, and I don't know which one you meant. For you, it's easy to decide what it is because, once again, you can see that those spectrums of color, that 70% of nonverbal communication that we can't. So, hopefully that's been educational for you guys. That's all I have for today, and hopefully I'll make a new video soon. Bye.